Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. It's great to have so many interested people here. And I want to thank the RWI and Morten Institute for inviting me to come today and for allowing me to be part of such an excellent panel. Thank you for that. As you just heard, my name is Camilla Ida Ravnbøl. I'm a postdoc at the University of Copenhagen. And I've been working specifically with Roma issues since 2005. My primary interest field is anthropology of law, as a research field for exploring how law and regulations influence the social life of people and the numerous relations and positions that people take in society. Is that better? Yes. Perfect. So, over the course of the next 40 minutes, I will give you an example of that by introducing you to my thesis, which, as Alejandro said, is called Bottle Hunters, an Ethnography of Law and Life amongst Homeless Roma in Copenhagen. The thesis overall concerns the ways in which Roma from Romania who live in homelessness in Copenhagen understand themselves as being EU citizens and how they experience the implementation of national and regional law on their bodies and personhood. In short, the thesis aims to shed light on the social life of EU law as it materializes into structures in society and into social relations of importance for these Roma women and men. And I will return to unfold these arguments later in the presentation. I'll first describe my field of research and the broader legal and political context that it places itself within. I'll briefly talk about my fieldwork and data before I move on to explain some of my arguments and findings and close with a few broader perspectives. Yes. But before I do that, I would like to introduce you to the field that I was in by returning to an episode from my fieldwork and reading aloud a small ethnographic vignette from when I did the fieldwork. So this incident took place on a late winter evening in the streets of a neighborhood in Copenhagen. Who makes the laws? May they have only sorrow. They do not think of the children as without their mother they grow up. The voice of a young man called Costi resonates in a high-pitched and vibrating tone as he sings a Romanian folk song called Who Makes the Laws? Costi's voice is soft and out of tune, and yet it leaves a stark silence in the cold winter air as he ends the final verse. Just a few blocks away from Costi, a married couple called Maria and Petru sleeps underneath the roof of an office building. They have wrapped themselves in warm blankets and lie on top of cardboard paper to insulate themselves from the frozen ground. Around the corner from where Costi sings, a group of women and men stand outside a social cafe which offers free meals to the homeless. They shudder in the cold, and the breaths resemble thin clouds in the lights from the street lamps. Tonight the group is engaged in a heated discussion. A woman furrows her eyebrows and asks me, "Why are the police always chasing us?" A man exclaims angrily, "And why will no one hire us or rent us a place to live in?" He then supplements his question with a sarcastic comment, "Oh, so you're from Romania? No, not here. Go home." The group laughs a brief and equally sarcastic laughter. For lack of a more substantive reply, I comment that it seems to be difficult for some Romanian migrants to earn a livelihood in Copenhagen. "We are not migrants," exclaims a middle-aged man called Vasile. He sends me a sharp look and continues in a harsh tone of voice. "Migrants are those from Africa and the Middle East. We are in the European Union and we are EU citizens." So Costi, Maria, Petru and Vasile are some of the Romanian Roma who I meet in Copenhagen from 2014 and onwards. They come from Romania, a member state of the European Union, but they also belong to the Roma population who constitute the largest ethnic minority in Romania and in the EU as a whole. Roma are, however, also amongst the poorest in Europe, and in Romania 70% of the Roma population lives in poverty. The families who I followed in my fieldwork live in such conditions of poverty in Romania. When they migrate to Denmark and settle in Copenhagen, they live in homelessness, and sleep roughly in the city's side streets. They primarily earn their income from the revenue that they earn from refundable bottles and cans that they locate outside the nightclubs and in the garbage bins across the city. These homeless Roma are in a strange way both visible and invisible to the general public. They live in a street milieu that many residents in Copenhagen barely notice, and they work with the scrap items that others have discarded. These images are from different music festivals in Copenhagen, the Distortion Street Party and the Roskilde Music Festival outside Copenhagen. The pictures highlight the contrast between the festival participants who engage in acts of leisure and the Roma who are working with refundable beverage containers. Especially the picture from the Roskilde Music Festival over here illustrates quite well the social invisibility of the Roma as they pick up the garbage items from the feet of the participants at the festivals. But at the same time, the Roma are at the heart of contemporary political debates about the rights of destitute EU citizens to reside in Denmark. Debates that in 2017 led to changes to Danish legislation to enhance the criminalization of homelessness in Denmark, with the particular aim to eradicate what the politician called Roma camps. Now, for the non-Danish speaking audience, or non-Swedish speaking audience, these are different clips from newspaper articles that show parts of the discourse that unfolded prior to the law amendments and just after. So formulations such as Copenhagen suffer from Roma camps and begging, and even harsher rhetoric that the Roma occupations should be stopped. They exploit us, they harass us, and they destroy the street image with garbage and excrements. And then debates about emphasizing or implementing the new law against begging or enhanced penalties for begging, and how it shouldn't affect the Danish homeless because the aim is to target the foreign homeless. So just a few examples of the debate. And these political debates led to changes to national legislation in 2017, where amendments were made that increasingly criminalize activities such as rough sleeping and begging. The amendments included 2 new provisions to the Code on Public Order in order to prohibit camping in public space and allows for prohibition zones to be installed. So despite not specifying what camp-like conditions actually mean and what discomfort is, in Danish the word would be utryghed, which I have translated to discomfort. This is my translation. There is no official English translation of this law. But despite not defining what the concept means, the formulation of these provisions is important, both because they make certain actions that homeless people engage in unlawful, but also for the moral legitimacy that the law claims by deeming certain groups in society as a potential danger to other citizens, as creating discomfort amongst the general population by being homeless. And it also allows for the removal of such subjects from public space through prohibition zones that can push them out, especially from the city center. And I shall continue to unfold this argument later in the presentation by showing how my interlocutors respond to it. And then finally, amendments were made to the Danish Criminal Code, where begging was already illegal, but they enhanced the penalty quite significantly. If you beg in pedestrian streets, railway stations, and means of public conveyance, you can receive up to 2 weeks of unconditional imprisonment upon a first-time offense. So this context sparked my interest in the Roma who collect refundable bottles in the city. The debates and constant changes to the law during my fieldwork and writing of the thesis motivated me to study what the EU free mobility framework becomes once it reaches street level in a very literal sense of the term. I was curious as to how EU laws are implemented into the lives of homeless Roma in Copenhagen, and how they in return relate such experiences to other legalities and moralities that shape their everyday lives. So my thesis and the presentation today will present some answers to such questions. And I will elaborate on that just after I describe my fieldwork, my methods, and data. So, my primary fieldwork location was Copenhagen's public space, since this is where homeless people live out their private lives. This included meeting them in the streets where they sleep and work, participating in the work with refundable bottles across the city, and during the intense music festivals, such as the Roskilde Music Festival. It included spending rainy days inside shelters and social cafes that offer resting space to the homeless. I also made several travels to Romania to visit the Roma neighborhood that my interlocutors live in, which is located on the margins of a larger city. Here my fieldwork primarily took place inside the private homes of the families and included conversations with parents and grandparents, young and older children, siblings, cousins, and other extended kinship ties. I also held interviews with civil society, lawyers, members of the EU Commission, and had focus group sessions with 23 Danish police officers. Finally, I conducted research in historical archives in Romania and analyzed legal case file from the Danish court that I was granted access to. I then triangulated all this data, and that has resulted in the analysis that I will present for you today. Good. So let me now turn to describe the arguments and findings of the thesis. When I joined these Roma women and men in their everyday lives, I learned that they are the protagonists of the folk song, Who Makes the Laws, that Kosti sings on that cold winter evening that I described in the opening to this presentation. They are the mothers and fathers who leave the children behind in Romania in order to work abroad. I also learned that the questioning of what the law is and of who makes the law is not only central to Kosti's song, but is elemental to the everyday practices, reflections, and experiences of my interlocutors. In fact, I realized that the emic category that this group uses to define themselves emerges from and reflects this relationship with the law. And I shall try and elaborate how this plays out more precisely. The Roma who I focused my attention on refer to themselves as being Badokari. Badokari is not an ethnic category, not an ethnonym used by a specific Roma group. Rather, it's a self-defined plural term that my interlocutors use to define themselves as an emic category. It relates to their economic occupation with refundable bottles in Copenhagen. Badokari directly translates to bottle people, since it originates from an older Romanian term for beverage containers used by this group, Badoac. Since the Badokari frequently use the term of chasing bottles and describe this as a practice of intensity that requires skills and knowledge and patience and endurance, I have chosen to further translate Badokari to bottle hunters. The seasonality of their trade, which peaks in the summer, where people drink outdoors, and slows down in the winter, where income is extremely low, give further connotations to this practice as a form of urban hunting. In my thesis, I treat Badokari not only as an emic category, but also as an analytical category. And this is because my ethnography shows that the term Badokari is not only a reference to an economic occupations of bottle hunting, it also emerges as a form of collective identification, shaped in response to legal structures in society and to ethical norms associated with lawfulness. And I will now go to explain how this unfolds more in detail by highlighting some of the findings in the thesis which concern these multiple sites where the Badokari negotiate this social identification in relation to the law. And these sites include a segregated Roma neighborhood in Romania, a Danish labor economy, Copenhagen street economy, encounters with Danish police officers, and cases in the Danish justice system. I also highlight aspects of the moral economy of the Balukari, which unfolds across these sites and relations, respectively. I first turn the attention to Romania and show how, for my interlocutors, EU free mobility rights translate into moral obligations to travel abroad in order to provide for their families at home. The families are critical towards the social exclusion that they experience in Romania, where the rights that they have as citizens and national minorities do not translate into concrete livelihood possibilities such as housing, employment, and quality education. In response to these circumstances, most of the families are very poor and have large debts to local moneylenders, such as the family who lives in the house in this picture. The debt accumulates fast, since the interest rates that the moneylenders charge on the loans are usually between 30% and 70%. The Balukari travel abroad in order to repay debt to the moneylenders and to cover basic subsistence costs of the families at home. Or as Anna says, not everyone goes to Denmark, but the poor ones do. I then turn to an EU context and show how most of my interlocutors resided in other EU member states prior to their arrival in Denmark. Many had in fact worked up to 12 years in Italy and Spain. However, most had not been able to access formal employment contracts and worked in the informal economies in the construction industry, agriculture, and elderly care. They worked in patron-client arrangements where they were aware of being financially exploited, but they saw this meager income as better in comparison with earning nothing at home in Romania. When the Eurozone crisis and the global financial crisis affected the economies in Southern Europe, many informal workers lost their jobs with their employers, their patrons. They went bankrupt. My interlocutors also lost their jobs and initiated a travel north to Scandinavia, and some came to Denmark. I hereafter turn to a Danish context and show how EU free mobility rights give them a generic right to move and reside temporarily. But the Balukari, as well as many other destitute EU citizens, cannot fulfill national regulations for long-term residence in Denmark. One example is their difficult access to a Danish personal identification number called the CPR number. The Balukari refer to the CPR number as the magical digits. Having that number grants access to a range of public services, but it's impossible for EU workers to access a CPR number without a housing address and a labor contract, or economic means to prove self-sufficiency. So in this way, many destitute EU citizens encounter a self-exclusive circle, or a catch-22, where access to CPR numbers are hindered by the lack of labor contract, housing, economic means, or access to a university enrollment. But access to employment and housing and income is also hindered by the lack of a CPR number. Or as Laura says, if you don't have the magical digits, you cannot do anything. You need them to look for a job, but you also need a job to get them. And this way it becomes all about opening and closing Sesame's doors to possibilities. Labor market barriers cause my interlocutors to instead turn to informal work, and some become bottle hunters in Copenhagen's street economy. Engaging in the street economy, however, opens for a range of other social dynamics. Here, the Balukari often experience a tension between socio-economic status and moral status. And this is because they grant importance both to economic profit and to ethical norms associated with lawfulness, where they value being law-abiding individuals. One example is when the Balukari on one hand envy the thieves in the street for their more lucrative enterprise. On the other hand, they resent the thieves for breaking the law and religious principles. They also ascribe low moral status to the vagabonds, who spend their income on personal alcohol consumption and thereby fail parental obligations for supporting their children back home. Among my interlocutors, being Badukari is thereby associated with having a poor economic status, but a high moral status, since they respect the law, God, and support their families at home. And this is best captured in one of their most frequent statements of saying, "I am poor, but clean." The Badukar thereby emerges as a form of moral ideal type of a person who's both legally and morally clean. But I also illustrate the difficulties that lie in adhering to such an ideal when you live in the street and constantly chase income possibilities to provide for the most basic needs of the family at home. In my thesis, I follow the life trajectories of several of my interlocutors and show how some of them eventually do not manage to stay entirely clean, neither in a legal nor in a moral sense of the term. I explore this fragility of moral cleanliness by analyzing how the Badukari evaluate persons who move away from the Badukar ideal. For example, they distinguish between persons who sometimes have to steal because their children are hungry at home, and the thieves, who the Badukari think steal without an emergent need to do so and with a disregard of others. It is the sense of moderation and social obligation which defines a moral cleanliness for the Badukari, of not allowing the children at home to starve, but also of not turning toward liking money, as they say, almost in an Aristotelian sense of practicing temperance. Finding this intermediate ground is relative, however, since it may be obtainable in one context and not another. One example is a man called Dragos, who is very keen on underlining his difference from the thieves when he says, "I am different from them. They take people's things, but I don't. I just take all things that people don't want." So Dragos is hyper-clean in his relationship with the law, and he even denounces thieves to the police at the police station to underline his own lawfulness. Dragos, however, fails to control other passions, such as gambling and drinking, which are abundant sources of temptations in the street, and which eventually causes marriage to disrupt. I shall now turn to look at two different sides, where the Badukari negotiate their identification in relation to the law, and this includes encounters with Danish police officers and court cases in the Danish justice system. As I mentioned previously, Danish law was changed during my writing of the thesis. In 2017, legal amendments were made to increasingly criminalize homelessness by prohibiting camping in public space. And the politicians openly stated that their intention was to target these Roma camps. And one example is that the legal definition of a camp is stretched to include, for example, this man who sleeps alone on top of cardboard paper in a sleeping bag on the street. In this sense, the Badukari find themselves at the heart of a juridified politics, where social issues such as homelessness and political issues relating to immigration control are increasingly solved through the means of law. So in the encounters with Danish police, the Badukari experience to be shaped as criminal subjects in two ways. One way is when the officers interpret and implement the new law discrepantly against the homeless population, in the sense that foreigners, and Romanians especially, by far outnumber those who are arrested for camping in public space. Statistics show that since the change of the law, there have been 389 arrests, out of which 300 were Romanians and only 6 were Danish. A second way is when the Badukari continuously experience police stops, controls, and even body searches when they walk in the streets of Copenhagen. This is because the officers' judgments are influenced by ethnic biases that associate Roma with crime. And this is captured in one quote by a police officer who I interviewed. But we must also recognize that the only word in Romanian that we know is tap-tarap. That means to steal. So the first thing that we always ask when we meet them is tap-tarap. And to this they reply, no, tap-tarap. So the Badukari challenged this treatment by demanding recognition of their individual variation and their equality before the law. One example is Florica, when she says, after all, we are also humans, and we are ashamed. Because if the Danes see us like this, stopped by the police, they will eventually get scared of us. As the final site of investigation, I shed light on how the strategic twisting of EU law affect the Badukari in court cases in the Danish justice system. One example is a case from 2014 where a Roma woman I call Adriana is arrested for sleeping in public space. Adriana's case exemplifies the dual powers of law to both construct power relations and to challenge such relations. For example, when Adriana, in her case, is turned from a sleeping woman into a law offender when she's arrested and convicted, but with the help of lawyers, her case is appealed, and she ultimately turns into a victim of unlawful arrest and is given financial compensation. Adriana's case took place in 2014, meaning before Danish law was changed. Her case could potentially have looked much different had it happened today, where several lawyers and organizations highlight the lack of legal clarity and the different outcomes that cases involving homeless EU citizens are actually taking. But at that time, in her case, EU law served to challenge Danish legal practices and underscore her rights as an EU citizen. It underlined a sense of rights that many of the Badukari have, such as when Vasile harshly rejects my reference to him as a migrant and corrects it to EU citizen. Or as Vasile later elaborates, but we are European Union citizens. We are part of one big family. We have rights to be treated equally and access jobs, places to live, these laws. But there is a double standard, and they find excuses not to give us our rights. Together, the analytical chapters in this thesis shed light on the nexus between law and morality. It shows how laws claim moral legitimacy, for example, by pushing homeless foreigners out of the city center, since they generate societal discomfort. And also how lawfulness, that of being legal, is at the heart of individual moral reasoning and of the ethical claims that my interlocutors set forward against others. What is interesting to me as an ethnographer are the detailed and numerous ways in which law and morality interweave in the course of the everyday lives of social subjects. In my case, a group of Roma who live on the margins of society within Europe. And I shall now close my presentation and sketch out a few broader perspectives. The thesis findings feed into a broader discussion of EU citizenship. The Badukari are very conscious of their rights-based mobility as EU citizens, which is different from other forms of negative rights talk that they express, for example, when they talk about Romania. However, they criticize EU mobility rights for having little meaning when they're not combined with other substantial rights that enable them to establish a viable livelihood over the longer term, neither in Romania nor in other EU member states. Or as best captured in the words of a young man called Suraj, when I asked him what he thought of his rights as an EU citizen. One thing is to travel, another is to dwell. So by way of closure, being Badukari means to be persons who live in poverty and debt in Romania, persons who have solitary rights to move, but no corresponding rights for dwelling, persons for whom free mobility rights translate into moral obligations to continuously travel, to provide financially for their families at home. They are bottle hunters who engage in an economic niche of bottle refund, which is actually established in Danish law. They are physically dirty because they work with scrap, but legally and morally clean since they are law-abiding and religious. Being a badokar is, however, also a fragile category of identification, since there's constantly a pressure to shift niches, either because of economic pressure from home, or because of the constant risks and temptations that the street milieu has to offer, or because the police conflate the badokari with other criminal subjects, and ultimately because the homeless livelihoods that they regard as legally clean are in fact criminalized. In a broader perspective, the case of the badokari serves as a test of the EU project, which is actually funded upon principles of market integration and social inclusion. The experiences of the badokari in this thesis and the critique that they raise towards their actual possibilities to dwell as EU citizens can serve as inspiration for how to enhance this so-called commitment to social inclusion. Thank you.